Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here for the third time and to be debating Michael Shermer in this venue for the second time. The last time I believe we debated is Christianity good for the world? And here today we'll be debating is Christianity good for America, but specifically for American politics. Now, in order to consider what Christianity has done for the world, you might begin by asking what would the world look like if there wasn't Christianity? If Christianity had never existed, what would happen to the world? What would happen to America? What would American history look like? What would American politics, not just the politics of Christians, but also the politics of non-Christians, look like if it wasn't for Christianity? Sometimes when we think of secular culture, we think of places like Europe, Norway. But Europe, you only have to walk around to see, is not in a profound sense secular. Europe is drenched in Christian, not just Christian cathedrals, not just Christian art, not just Christian painting, but also Christian educational institutions that have embedded ideals and marinated beliefs into Western civilization that even secular people hold uncritically. If these secular people would burrow down to why they think that, and where does this idea come from, they would see that this idea in its root came into Western civilization via Athens and Jerusalem. In other words, via the ancient Greece and Rome, but also via Christianity, Judaism and Christianity. And remember, even Athens comes to us by way of Rome. In other words, when we look back at Socrates, when we look back at Plato, we read him through 1,000 years of Christian civilization. So even the Greeks, as we understand them now, don't come to us unmediated, but come through us through the filter of more than a millennium of Christianity. I would argue that if you make a list of the beliefs of secular people, atheists, what are the things that they care about? The dignity of the individual, the importance of science as an autonomous discipline and a way to find the truth, the idea of compassion as a social value, the importance of human life, the importance of social justice. If you look at these very secular ideals that right now are at the centerpiece of our political debate, just listen to a relatively secular guy like Barack Obama. Here's Barack Obama, and now he's a Christian, I suppose, but he's not a traditional Christian. I would argue that Obama subscribes to a rather mutant strain of Christianity that I would call third world liberation theology. But nevertheless, if you listen to Obama, his imagery is drenched in Christian rhetoric. One of his favorite phrases is, "We are our brother's keeper," lifted, by the way, right out of the Bible. Now, Obama uses this phrase, he's used it over 50 times, with almost breathtaking hypocrisy. His own actual brother, George Obama, lives in a hut in Nairobi on a few dollars a month, unassisted by his multimillionaire sibling living at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. So Christianity here is being honored not in the practice, but nevertheless in the principle. And while Obama doesn't impose these principles on himself, some people say, I don't like to impose my Christian morality on others, but Obama doesn't like to impose it even on himself. Nevertheless, he is articulating a principle of social obligation that has its roots in Christianity. It certainly doesn't have its roots in science. Science by itself doesn't articulate any automatic social obligation. Certainly in doctrines like evolution, we can have a possible explanation for why people might be moral, but there certainly is no social justice gospel that comes out of it. Look at a principle as simple as the idea that human life is valuable. Human life is precious. Some people would say human life is sacred. Now, I would assume that secular people take this for granted, but historically, this principle was extremely controversial. It was certainly not affirmed in any general sense, even in Western civilization before Christianity. If you think of the ancient Greeks and Romans, they would have not only mass slavery, but the Spartans would take the unwanted kid, deposit it on the hillside, only to find it dead in the morning. And even the greatest thinkers of ancient Greece and Rome were well aware of this, but looked at it with virtual equanimity, with indifference. Why? Because the idea that every human life has value was at best a very qualified principle in that civilization. So today's idea that we should respect life, that life has dignity. By the way, the idea that human life has dignity is not simply a matter of abortion or euthanasia. It is at the very core of the UN Charter of Human Rights. The whole concept of universal rights comes out of the notion that human life has value and dignity. But why? Why should human life have dignity? Is there anything intrinsic about it that makes it different from the life of, let's say, a horse or a toad or a fruit fly? What confers dignity on human beings and not on those other creatures? Where do we get that peculiar idea? Then we go to another powerful idea in American politics, an idea without which our politics would be incomprehensible, and that is the idea of compassion. And compassion here, by the way, does not refer to the tribal principle that we should be helpful to people who are related to us. That's a universal principle. And in many cultures, anthropologists will tell us that people generally feel that you should help your family. And then beyond that, if you have some left over, you help your relatives, and then your neighbors, and then maybe your kinsmen or members of your tribe. But that's usually kind of it. And if somebody else shows up from another tribe or somebody who's a complete stranger and they have a problem, well, you might want to help if you feel like it, but you really don't need to. It's not your problem. Because ultimately, they're nothing to you. They're not a member of your group. However, in Western civilization, almost uniquely, we have this idea of universal brotherhood and compassion for the stranger who is truly nothing to us. Tomorrow there was a big famine in Haiti or in Ethiopia. You could almost predict in advance the global reaction. In China, a massive yawn of indifference. In India, inaction. In the Muslim world, there's a lot of oil money over there, but there would be no automatic obligation to help. Meanwhile, there would be a big convulsion throughout the West, the European countries and America, churches getting active, food being sent all over the place, Doctors Without Borders, St. Jude's Hospital, and all of this, I'm saying, the secular part and the Christian part. Why are they coming only from Western civilization? Why here? Are Western people inherently more large-hearted than people elsewhere in the world? Nonsense. My point is that Western people, whether they are nominally secular or actively Christian, have been shaped by the same culture of universal brotherhood and obligation to the stranger, and that principle was injected into the West by Christianity. Some of these Christian ideas, I admit, were derived from Judaism, but Judaism, in a way, implemented them in a sort of tribal way, that these are God's truths for our people. And what Christianity did was take those principles and universalize them, giving them a much wider and a much broader application. And now I want to fast forward a little bit and talk about the American founding. And this question sometimes disputed about whether America is a Christian nation. Well, I guess you have to think about what do you mean when you say something like that. Very often those debates degenerate into arguments about did Ben Franklin go to church and was Thomas Jefferson really devout and what were Washington's true religious commitments. And we can have that discussion. But to me, the question of whether America is a Christian nation is a way of asking, are the core principles of America, and by this I mean its economic principles, its underlying philosophical foundation, the way America conducts its foreign policies, the way America's government is structured, what are the underlying assumptions, and where do those assumptions come from? Think of some features of our government: separation of powers, checks and balances. Why do we have those? What is the need to separate powers? What's the point of it? Other cultures don't have that. You have democratic societies that don't have separation of powers or checks and balances. Why do we have those? Because underlying those is a certain assumption about human nature. And what is that assumption? It was given very clearly in a way by Immanuel Kant 2 centuries ago. Out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. Which is to say that human nature is a little bent. It's a little warped. And if you give power to human beings in that way, they are going to misuse it, most likely. And therefore, power has to be given, but therefore, let's distribute it. And even distributing it isn't enough. Because you can have bargains among corrupt people who say, I'll scratch your back and you scratch mine. So quite apart from separating power, you need third parties looking over what people are doing and blocking them. So if you look at American politics, there's an inbuilt inertia. Sometimes it seems like nothing ever gets done. But that is by design. Nothing ever gets done because we want to stop human nature from having its full corrupt flower. This idea, again, very antithetical to the premise of modern liberalism. The premise of modern liberalism is that liberty is wonderful, and when you let people be free, they will use freedom well. This, by the way, is a principle held in defiance of all known facts. You simply have to look around you to see that many times, maybe most often, liberty is not used well. My friend Michael Shermer is a libertarian. I would argue that the best way to be a libertarian is to reject the liberal assumption that often undergirds libertarianism and to replace it with the Christian assumption that the case for liberty depends on showing how corrupt people and a warped human nature should nevertheless be given the exercise of liberty. How does that work? Why is that a good idea? So I mentioned separation of powers and checks and balances. Let's look for something that was truly bad about America, in fact, America's original sin, many would say, and that's slavery. Now, American slavery was anomalous in some ways in that it was racial slavery, different from, say, Greek and Roman slavery, which was not based on race. But nevertheless, American slavery was common in the sense that it was based upon a universal practice. Slavery existed everywhere in the world from the beginning, the dawn of mankind. Now again, very interestingly, this universal practice of slavery was abolished in only one culture, Western culture. There is no example of an anti-slavery movement outside the West, anywhere in the world, at any time. So again, we have an interesting question. Are people in the West morally more elevated than everybody else? They simply think more deeply? No. They have ideals. They have a set of ideals that caused people in the West to look at slavery, which was, by the way, like the family, an institution taken for granted. For many centuries, slavery needed no defenders because it had no critics. But suddenly people began to look at slavery differently. Now, Michael Shermer is likely to say, well, that's because in the modern era, the Enlightenment came along and people began. No. The anti-slavery movement in Western civilization began in the 4th century. That was around the time that Constantine converted to Christianity. And by the 10th century, there were virtually no slaves left in Europe. Slavery was abolished in Europe between the 4th century and the 10th century, long before the Reformation and the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and the Scientific Revolution and all of it. Now, there was a second anti-slavery wave in America that came later, and that too was led by the Quakers and the evangelical Christians and a whole bunch of guys who said, wait a minute, if we are created equal in the eyes of God, then no man has the right to rule another man without his consent. And if you think about it, this idea, a theological idea, by the way, is now given a novel political implication. For some centuries, some Christians thought that that idea applied only to the next world. But the Quakers and the evangelicals said, no, if we are equal in the eyes of God, we are equal in the eyes of God now, and that means that there shall be no rule without consent. And by the way, if you think about it, this is not only the anchoring principle of anti-slavery, of abolition, but it's also the anchoring principle of democracy. Why? Because democracy, modern American democracy, the democracy we're going to be exercising in 1 month, almost to the day, democracy is based on the same idea. No man, no person has the right to rule another without consent. So here we go. Here is a principle of democracy which is secular, which in no way requires you, when you go to vote, you're not required to subscribe to the 10 Commandments or carry a copy of the Bible, and yet, if it wasn't for the Bible, you wouldn't believe that. You wouldn't be doing that. So in some senses, when we talk about is America a Christian nation, the right way to answer that question is it not a fact, an historical fact, that Christianity has embedded into this culture, even into atheists, a way of thinking, so that even atheist hostility comes out of Christianity. Think about it. Atheists disbelieve in the Christian God. They pretend to disbelieve in other gods, but they don't really care. They don't really consider it even possible that these other gods could be true. On the other hand, they rage against the Christian God because they're afraid of him. Consider Richard Dawkins. The God of the Old Testament, and I'm quoting him here by paraphrase, but it's pretty close to his actual words, is a megalomaniacal, genocidal, fratricidal, homicidal, homophobic, sexist, maniac. Think about that for a moment. First of all, this is very odd language coming from a biologist. Second of all, why would you be so angry about a God that you don't even think exists? Why would you be raving and ranting about if I read about Othello or Hamlet, I might write an analysis for a paper, but it doesn't get me all worked up, because I know that this character is fictional. The reason Richard Dawkins gets really worked up is this is the God that he rejects, the Christian God, the Jewish and Christian God. So even atheists are fighting a negative war against the only God that they consider has a real possibility of being true. That's why they have to work to bring him down, because he might win if they stop trying. Now, let's talk a little bit about American politics today. I would argue that American politics today, in all its dimensions, is in the same manner deeply influenced by Christianity, even again in unacknowledged ways. In a way, what we're saying is that secular America is standing on a Christian mountain that even secularists are not willing to acknowledge. Look at America's policies, for example, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in the Middle East, really anywhere in the world, not just now, let's say over the past 50 years. There was a great debate when America dropped 2 bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, even though those bombs ended up shortening the duration of the war, arguably saving thousands of not only American, but even Japanese lives. But even so, there's a big debate about dropping that bomb. Why? In any other culture, the dropping of those bombs would be national holidays because of the exhilaration of bringing victory at the end of a long and exhausting war. But here in America, there's no celebration, and this is hotly debated, and it's debated only here. And why? Because there is in America this idea that you're not allowed to deliberately kill civilians for any reason. You are not allowed to target civilians in a war and kill them. You're allowed to kill soldiers, but not civilians. Remember, right after 9/11, American planes bombing Taliban targets in Afghanistan, but dropping rations of food for civilians. Where does this come from? It comes out of the just war theory of Christianity. It comes from no place else. So what I'm trying to say here is, ultimately, I think for Michael Shermer, this will all come down to abortion and gay marriage and gay marriage and gay marriage again, and I'm happy to talk about that. But if you put the bigger framework on things, you will see that our culture and our politics have been decisively, unarguably, historically, and for the better, shaped by Christianity. Thank you very much.